Good afternoon and welcome to the Rumi Forum. We're here with Asma Uddin today for our luncheon series, Countering Hate Speech with Social Responsibility. Asma Uddin is the founder and editor-in-chief of altmuslimah. She joined the Becket Fund as an international legal fellow in 2009. She has several years of experience practicing commercial litigation at prestigious national law firms, and she has handled a significant number of asylum, prisoners, civil rights, constitutional, and employment discrimination cases. Most recently, she played an integral role in a case brought by a Muslim policewoman against the city of Philadelphia for its refusal to allow the plaintiff to wear the Muslim headscarf on the job. As an editor, Asma has worked with Dr. Umar F. Abd-Allah on a number of articles for scholarly journals on Islamic law. She also helped edit the entire manuscript of Dr. Abd-Allah's A Muslim in Victorian America, which was published in 2007 by Oxford University Press. As an associate editor and legal columnist for Islamica Magazine, Asma focused her writings on how American Muslims can rethink their social position within the American legal framework. Asma's writing has appeared in Muslim Girl magazine, altmuslimah, BeliefNet, and The Guardian. Her most scholarly work has been published in the Rutgers Journal of Law and Religion and the Review of Faith and International Affairs. In May 2008, Asma was part of a U.S. State Department delegation to Norway, Belgium, and Ireland, where she met with Muslim and other minority groups, as well as politicians, journalists, and a number of prominent anti-discrimination organizations. In April 2009, Asma was selected as a Muslim Leader of Tomorrow. Most recently, she was named an expert panelist for the Washington Post Newsweek blog on faith. Asma is a 2005 graduate of the University of Chicago Law School, where she was a member of the University of Chicago Law Review. Please welcome Asma Uddin. We're so happy to have you with us today. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
And to start things off, the interest, I think, came of many of the people that have come today from the title, Countering Hate Speech with Social Responsibility. I'm wondering if you can expand, elaborate on this title.
Well, as you mentioned, I'm an attorney, and I recently started the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty. The Becket Fund is a law firm that deals solely with cases of religious freedom, both domestically and internationally. And so as lawyers, as a law firm, what we're often concerned about is when people see certain social phenomena like hate speech and feel that the best way to counter that is with legal sanctions. And we definitely see the problems with sanctioning something legally because oftentimes a lot of the countries we're dealing with have laws such as blasphemy laws, anti-conversion laws, and so on. They cause inordinate amounts of human rights abuses. And so our position is that we acknowledge that these are problems. For instance, Islamophobia or anti-Muslim bigotry is a problem, and we acknowledge that. But we think that the best way to counter it and to solve it is with social remedies as opposed to legal sanctions.
Right, right. And if you could elaborate more on that, in your synopsis you talk about the use of free speech through education, legal defense, and the arts to respond to prejudices. And I'm particularly interested in the usage of free speech and social responsibility when it comes to free speech and dealing with these sort of this sort of hate speech or prejudicial speech or Islamophobic, this sort of rhetoric. Can you expand more on that?
Well, again, a lot of the times when people speak about these legal sanctions, they usually do it in the form of limiting free speech rights. We need to stop people from saying the following things. For instance, the Defamation of Religions resolution, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, says that the best way to solve problems of hate speech and hate crimes and Islamophobia is by limiting speech. So anything that can be subjectively interpreted as defaming or blaspheming your religion should be banned. But in reality, what that does, that just gives the state control over speech. And it gives because in order to determine what's wrong, you have to determine what's right, and there has to be only one standard of what's right. And who's going to come up with that? It's going to most likely be a state authority. And so our position is that, not only in terms of protecting free speech as a broad abstract principle, But in terms of practical solutions, the best way to deal with bad speech is by countering it with good speech.
Right.
And so it's really sort of like using free speech in the context of your social solutions.
Right. I think our experience as Americans has really been the reaction to such rhetoric and such speech is freedom of speech, and it's not necessarily bringing up and into a law to combat it, but rather the society at large sees it and isolates it, or sees the problem and speaks out against such hate speech, if you will, and uses things like dialogue and talking and education to try and bring knowledge to the situation, to, kind of, get rid of that sort of rhetoric, or to, have it kind of be isolated, isolate that sort of rhetoric.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the sort of benefits of focusing on social versus legal solutions is that it forces people to actually mediate themselves.
Right.
As opposed to just having the government have this top-down control
Right.
Of telling you what to do and what not to do, and you can still be harboring certain prejudices and hatred. But in fact, by putting the focus on society to come up with a solution themselves, they're forced to kind of like think about these things and to sort of to evolve. The social
Right.
progress is required.
Definitely. And the Becket Fund, can you tell a little bit more about how the Becket Fund, your organization that you are working for, representing, how it got involved in this conversation? Specifically, the Becket Fund addresses religious freedom, so I guess it's right up, the alley of the Becket Fund to deal with something like this. But can you maybe elaborate a bit more on what you're doing with the Becket Fund in regard to this?
Well, to the extent that religious freedom is a right that encompasses free assembly, freedom of association, free speech, we've been involved in that from the beginning. Something that's really brought to the forefront is the Defamation of Religions Resolution, which was first proposed in 1999, and we've been working on that for the past few years. I, of course, am new to the Becket Fund, but the Becket Fund has been working on that.
Right.
And that's something that's really sort of brought this discussion to the fore on a global level, the relationship between free speech and religious freedom. And just in the nature of freedoms generally.
Right.
And actually a program that we're planning on rolling out soon is actually very much based on this type of topic. We want to host a roundtable with prominent Muslim leaders and to kick off a program where we begin to help people understand legal versus sociological remedies. And we're actually partnering with the Muslim Public Affairs Council on that.
Right.
Well, they'll be handling the social aspect and we'll be handling the legal part.
Wonderful. Good. With that said, I'm thinking that unless you have more to add to our conversation, but if we could maybe open it up to Q&A, or if there's more that you would like to elaborate on, I think we can. I think there's a lot of questions out there within the audience. So we'll open up to Q&A now, and once again, when you do get the microphone, please stand up and say your name and where you're coming from, if you would like. So, and also we can continue as the questions start to come, I think. So, all right. Yes. Okay, wonderful. And then it gets going, but it's always a first. Thanks, John. Thank you. Yeah, the light.
Hi, I'm John Boyer from One Blue, and Asma and I are colleagues. I was really fascinated, Asma, I don't know whether you heard this, Supreme Court, this case is going before the Supreme Court, which was on National Public Radio this morning. You probably missed it, right? But it was really relevant to what you're talking about, because as I understood it, it was quite legally complex. You heard it, Jenna?
I did.
Yeah.
I did hear it.
Well, it's hard to talk about it if you don't know much about it, but as I understood it, it was quite a controversial issue about the ability of organizations to work with various people that are deemed terrorists, and whether or not because they're terrorist organizations as defined by the State Department. Therefore, no one can. It's a criminally. You can be prosecuted for doing anything with them. This involved a foundation that was trying to. It was with the PKK, I believe, and they were trying to provide some sort of assistance to them that wasn't military. It was humanitarian, and yet it really came down to free speech rights, I thought, and who defines what a terrorist organization is. Now, I found it fascinating. I would have to go back and study it a little bit more carefully, but it sounded quite significant because it dealt with the underlying issue to me was, can we have free speech in America about, what is or what isn't terrorism and a terrorist organization and so on, and what kind of relationships can people have with terrorist organizations. Really, it was about free speech, I thought, and the case was being argued. I was kind of surprised, the attorney arguing for restricting the ability of organizations to deal with terrorist organizations was a lawyer who worked in the Bush administration and is now representing also the Obama administration, as I understand it. So it's very hard for you to talk about something you don't know about. But I was wondering, I was so fascinated with this case, I guess, has been developing for some time. And I was wondering whether you knew anything at all about things related to this.
And if I can just elaborate, I think what struck me, John, not necessarily the specific, the specific case, but the idea that if even you have an organization that has been deemed to be doing terrorist activities, that even some entity like USIP, the United States Institute of Peace, in terms of working with this entity with peace programs or reconciliation or conflict resolution, would be deemed as something not okay to do. That's kind of what, and that to me was more pertinent even than with that example. But I don't know if you know.
Well, I could just throw in here, part of the story was that Jimmy Carter was taking the position that with the African National Congress and the IRA, those were considered outlaw terrorist organizations, and yet there were ways to negotiate with them. And then he felt like, how else are we going to find accommodation with these groups? We should be able to do that. Whereas the case that's being argued before the Supreme Court is, whether you can criminalize this, even just talking to these people because they are deemed terrorists, and therefore, any kind of connection is considered a criminal act. I don't know. It's too complicated, I think, for you to comment on. But maybe it's something everyone here would want to look into. But I think it's highly relevant to the work that you're doing.
Well, I think as a threshold matter, all of our rights, like religious freedom and free speech and so on, the limits, at least in the American legal context, are usually at the point of national security. So that's just a threshold matter. But what you're referring to is a much sort of more broader interpretation of possibly what constitutes terrorism to begin with, and then once that sort of fits a certain clear definition, to what extent can we engage with them? And I think that there are definitely problems with an overbroad definition of terrorism. You see a lot of Muslims who their religious freedom is being infringed upon, but when, for instance, a lot of them are finding it difficult to perform the obligatory charity that they have to give, the zakat, because many times a lot of the charitable organizations are deemed terrorist. And in other situations you might have FBI in the mosques who are, and the very fact that they're there, you might not know they're undercover, but that is sort of putting some pressure on the khatib in terms of the sermon giver, in terms of defining what he can say and not, because oftentimes conservative statements that are not terrorist or extremist but are very conservative can be interpreted as having some link to terrorist activity. And just by the fact that you have to regulate your speech because of this fear of government penalties, that's an infringement of religious freedom. Right. So we're definitely entering into murky territory here, where it's not so easy just to say these freedoms are necessarily limited by national security, because then you get into a very sort of broad definition of that. Right. So that's what I can say about that.
Okay. Oh, the microphone.
Thanks. My name is Sarah Saeed. I'm also with One Blue and also a colleague of Asma's. Asma, I just want to say kudos to the Becket Fund for getting you on board, because I think you bring something very unique to the organization. And going back to some of your work in the past, I mean, I know you fought for people's rights to wear hijab at the job and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. I wanted to draw parallels in a recent case that you had sent me about Sarkozy passing a law that bans the niqab and burqa in public offices in France. And I wanted to get your take on whether or not the niqab itself has a religious basis versus more of a cultural and social basis, and also the difference in attitudes between how you've seen the system in America work and what the Europeans are facing in terms of women and the rights of women, Muslim women, to wear what they want to wear overseas. Thanks.
Okay. That's a great question. And actually, I think Sarah's position on that is that looking at the religious proof, she feels that the niqab is not religiously mandated. And therefore, if I understood your position correctly, you felt that it should not be defended as a religious right. And I thought that was interesting, because I think that people, again, are sort of thinking of religion in terms of one sort of clear authoritarian message. But in fact, what it is, the religion is what you interpret it to be. And religious freedom protects your ability to interpret it as is. So from my perspective, I feel that if a number of those women, and there aren't too many of them who wear the burqa in France, right, but for those who are wearing it as a reflection of their religious beliefs, and they feel that this is what's mandated by their religion or what's preferred by God, to stop that, especially from the perspective of the government, is to infringe on their religious freedom, because you're essentially taking away their right to interpret their religion for themselves. And so in the U.S., for the most part, 47 states, well, in the public sphere, we can definitely wear religious garb. There is a question now that's arisen in Oregon, for instance.
Yes, I was just going to say that, because yes.
Where, and I recently wrote about that as well.
Yes, you did.
Where public school teachers are not allowed to wear religious garb, and religious garb is anything that can be interpreted as distinctively associated with a religion. And it's interesting, because 47 states don't have this law, and they allow it, and there's no problem. And a lot of the arguments from the opposition against the proposed repeal of this law is that, well, once you allow this, you're going to see the school is going to be full of all these Wiccan teachers who are going to wear witch clothes to school, and there'll be members of the Church of Body Modification who will show up with facial jewelry, and your kids will have to deal with this. And it's really and it's interesting, because these laws are actually rooted in KKK history. They were inspired by KKK sympathizers in the state legislature. And it was really sort of shocking for me to see the opponents use similar tactics. It's well, for this tactic, the Muslims and the Sikhs might not seem scary enough, so we'll sort of refer instead to the witches, who apparently haven't taken over our schools in the other 47 states, but might actually do so in Oregon.
And it's really ironic who is making these arguments.
Well, I mean, the person that I sort of called out in a recent piece was somebody who's been a cooperating attorney for the ACLU for the past 38 years, and was actually the former president of the Oregon ACLU. So, I mean, I think the ACLU would argue that he's not really representing them, but to the extent that was stated during his testimony and his strong affiliations, it's really quite surprising that somebody so strongly affiliated with the ACLU is taking these types of positions.
Right. Very interesting.
Thanks for that answer, because my 14-year-old and I were talking for quite a while about that, and she kind of said what you did, that it's interpretation, and people should be free to interpret the way.
I mean, I think especially as somebody, I do run this website, altmuslimah, and it's all about exploring critical gender issues in Islam, and a lot of that obviously leads into questions of gender reforms, such as women's space in the mosque, and reinterpretation of our scriptures from a female position, because oftentimes the reason we're dealing with a lot of the things we're dealing with is because of patriarchal interpretations. And so I think that despite these are the sorts of things that begin to take away women's rights to interpretation, by saying that you can't even interpret what your religion says about what you're going to wear. How can you really see them kind of getting into the sphere where they can interpret religion in all these other spheres? And so I think there's definitely sort of a huge fundamental clash there in terms of religious freedom and what it says about religious reform as well.
Yeah, and I think that those that maybe say that well, that's not it's not a religious mandate to wear such, religious, attire, and then also to support it being outlawed. It's just kind of like it's a snowball. It just keeps going. The suppression of a woman's right to interpret, or a person's right to interpret their own religion. You just continue to suppress that right. Anyway, so.
I mean, I think especially just one more point about clothing, and a lot of the women who do cover, there's sort of their connection with the clothing, and when it's stripped away, how they feel exposed and vulnerable, and that can actually have a social effect in their level of confidence and their ability to engage with society.
Absolutely.
I mean, I was just thinking of this totally extreme example of like torture tactics in like prisoner, for prisoners of war, where oftentimes to break them down, they might strip them down, especially if they're, for instance, at the Abu Ghraib prisons, where these are Muslim men who have entrenched notions of modesty, and to sort of strip them down and sort of expose them. That's in many ways sort of going to the core of their religious sense of dignity.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right, well, okay. I was going to ask you something.
My name's Alan Rith. I'm from the U.S. Air Force. Just a quick question on not just the connections with Islamic examples, but how far back have you guys gone as far as using some other religious examples? Obviously, you're talking about the Oregon case, using Wiccans or something that children might find offensive. But I was thinking more along the lines of Nazi propaganda and the threat to the state and those type of things.
Well, like I said, I'm fairly new to the Becket Fund. But in terms of the Nazi example, I think in that case there is an incitement to violence. And I think there are certain thresholds you have to reach when something gets into the incitement to violence, which is a totally appropriate legal prohibition on speech. And it's important to make the distinction between incitement to violence and provocation. And so incitement to violence is basically if essentially A's speech causes B to be violent, or to cause violence. Whereas provocation would be something that, well, you're insulting me, makes me really angry, so I'm going to like burn your house down. There should never be a law protecting me and my violent impulses. So that's one way to sort of think about that. And in the case of the Nazis, they very much are at the point of inciting violence. The Nazi demonstrations are still allowed. They're still protected in free speech, but there's certain points at which their actions will kind of go to the next level. But maybe another example would be an international example where in Switzerland, a Christian pastor was just teaching his religious beliefs about the wrongness of homosexuality, and was a case brought against him saying that this is, homophobia, and you're propagating homophobia, and this is against our country's constitution in terms of like their societal constitution. And it was like, no, well, that's sort of what his religion teaches, and he should be able to say what his religion teaches. Because to take that away is to essentially tell him to change what his religion says, and to change what he interprets his religion to say. So that's another example, if that's helpful.
It's interesting looking at how Europe deals with versus how the U.S. deals with freedom of speech and religious freedom. We were talking earlier about Geert Wilders, and he's recently on trial for his anti-Islam, anti-Muslim film, and it's very interesting because just how you just spoke of something about homophobia and suppression of speech. It seems to me like Europe is dealing with it much differently than the U.S. and can you elaborate more on that?
European versus the U.S. and just a free speech.
Yeah, and how each deals with it.
For one, like Europe has a number of European countries have hate speech laws on the books, which the U.S. doesn't. And the Becket Fund's position is that hate speech laws are a bad idea. In addition to the fact that they do restrict totally nonviolent, peaceful, free speech, they tend to sort of lead you into a path of inconsistencies, which is what we're dealing with now. A lot of the Muslims here, especially in the context of incidents like this and also the defamation of religions resolution, would argue, well, in Europe there's like these Holocaust denial anti-Holocaust denial laws that, in other words, it's criminalized and you can't do that, but there's nothing like that for Islamophobia. And it's just that you're getting to this point where do you define where something is like bad enough for you to ban it, aside from the sort of their very physical sort of act of inciting violence. And so there is a fundamental difference, and it's leading to a lot of problems here.
Yeah. Anyway, as much as I don't like what this gentleman has to say, Mr. Wilders, but I still think, that there's something wrong when, we're going to, put him on trial for doing that. I just, as an American, we don't think that way, I guess, and that's coming from my own cultural background and my own mindset, but
well, one way I
as
try
an
to
American.
explain the Wilders situation is because I think a lot of Muslims would feel that this needs to be banned, and it is pretty, he's totally, completely, like, it's sort of steeped in bigotry, and it is very problematic, especially to the extent that he can get this political support that's rallying around him. But he's advocated for banning the Quran, and it's just like, well, that sounds completely ludicrous in the current free speech context. But the second you actually create precedent for banning his hate speech legally, you've essentially created that precedent for banning other forms of totally seemingly legitimate speech. And so just remember the slippery slope.
Right.
How much of that has to do with the fact that, as a country we were founded on the basis of religious freedom and pluralism, and so we allow for that, and we respect it on a social level, which is, I guess, what Becket Fund works on. But in Europe, a lot of, like even the French Revolution itself was a movement to actually shun religion to a large extent. So over there, the feeling that I get is more that it's trying to minimalize religion in Europe, whereas here it's trying to embrace it. So how much of that is socially making us more progressive in a way, religiously?
Well, I agree. I think there are different cultural and political histories definitely have a lot to say about how we approach these questions. Here we sort of embrace religion as a positive. Over there it's often seen as a negative. And so their concept of religious freedom is really freedom from religion. So yeah, I think that understanding it as a right and embracing the positive aspects of religion is definitely the way that helps us, enables our ability to fight for a lot of these religious rights.
You're going to be taking, you shared with me, you're going to be taking some trips coming up on behalf of the Becket Fund. Can you talk a bit about that and how that ties into the work that you're doing currently?
Sure. So the Becket Fund is in the process of creating legal training institutes in a number of different countries in the Muslim world. And so next week I'll be traveling to Cairo, and the following month I'll be in Jakarta in Indonesia. And then I'm back in Amman to actually start teaching these seminars. And what we're understanding, what we want to do as a law firm is to be able to help develop the bar in these different countries and to explain to people ranging from lay people to all the way up to like judges and lawyers and activists and philosophers in between, to essentially how to think about these issues and how to actually advocate or litigate for them, to use sort of the legal and the social means to make change. And so I'll be making this trip to begin to meet with a number of different groups. And the other thing the Becket Fund is very sensitive about is that we don't go in there preaching this sort of superior philosophy.
I was going to ask
we want to go there, we want to hear what they have to think, how they approach these issues, what they feel. And sort of work with them and work with those cultural sensibilities in order to sort of transmit our message.
Thanks for joining us today for another Rumi Forum Luncheon Talk, and thank you so much, Asma. And Asma, we hope to have her back to speak more about her other work that she does. She's doing a lot of writing for altmuslimah. You should all visit that website. They have very good articles on various topics related to Muslim women. So, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone.